I want to teach today concerning a psalm that at one point in my life really challenged me and changed my perspective on my life as it was. It made me much more trustful in God, gave me a real sense of peace and stability. It was also a bit of a challenge to me to act in such a way that my trust in God was clear and evident in my life. That it was evident to me, and then secondarily that it would be evident even to others. That it made a real difference, that trusting God made a difference for me in my life. I'd like to just read the psalm and then pray and ask for God's help. Psalm 127, there is a title to this psalm, which is, sometimes we have these headings in our Bibles and we skip them because, men just put them in there to kind of make it easier for us to understand or get the flow or find our spot where we want to read. This is different. Some of these psalms have titles that were part of the psalm. So part of what God wanted us to know was the title or some details about it. And this, sometimes in our hymn books we have songs that says anonymous or doesn't have a name next to it. Other times we put someone's name, we know who the author was. And we just do that to give credit. In case you're interested, you could go find out some more information. But a lot of times the Bible's not in the habit of giving us useless information rather. So here we have a title and we want to pay attention to it. It says, A Song of Ascents of Solomon. We were just talking about Solomon a little bit. This is written by Solomon. We'll explain what this A Song of Ascents of Solomon means, but notice it's there. It's part of what we have here in the Bible. Now, verse 1. Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. It is in vain that you rise up early and go late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil, for he gives to his beloved sleep. Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the children of one's youth. Blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them. He shall not be put to shame when he speaks with his enemies in the gate. All right, let's pray. Father in heaven, as I think about this psalm, there are certainly different portions of it that are very famous in different contexts and for different reasons. And I ask you to help me to put these things together for us all and to apply it to us. We ask for your assistance, Lord. It's really you're the one who needs to do these things. Help us today. We pray that each one who's come will receive what they need from you. In the name of Christ we ask these things. Amen. Well, we read it is a song of ascents. And that is a strange thing for us to think about, or a song of degrees, a song of the idea of ascending or stepping upwards in degrees is really what we're talking about. There are several psalms that are traditionally sung out, right, by travelers in Israel as they make their way to Jerusalem for the various feasts and gatherings in Jerusalem. Now, there are 15 of these. They're all kind of put together. Scholars kind of debate back and forth about how they all came together. Most of them think it was later in Israel's history, like after they returned from Babylon, before all these songs came together. That doesn't mean they were written before then, but they were kind of grouped together and assigned as, we're going to make these group of songs for this time in our religious calendar. We're going to make sure they get sung as we travel. And that's fine. And so, a song of ascents. Now, So that doesn't mean this was written by Solomon. It doesn't necessarily mean Solomon had in mind people going up to Israel as they sing this song. But Solomon wrote the song, and someone said, this is a song that we should be singing when we travel to Jerusalem on these feasts. When families are gathered together and making the trip, this is a great one, and this ought to be one of them. And that's part of your Bible. So however it got in there, whether Solomon wrote that, or whether Solomon's editor wrote it, right, or the scribe of Solomon who wrote all these things down and penned them, or whether someone else who put these things in their final form put that in there and said this is one of them, God's seen fit that that's in your Bible and that that's how these things were used. And so I want to pay attention to that. So again, on their way, there was a traditional set of songs that were sung by these travelers on their way. This is one of them. These songs are the kinds of songs that are supposed to help orient you afresh to the rightful place of God in your own thinking, to having a glad heart in God who provides for you and who is for you as your God. Again, there are 15 of these psalms. If you wondered which ones they are, they're from Psalm 120 to Psalm 134. These are the Psalms of Ascent as they make their way up to the city of God and to the hill of God. 4 of these are from David. One is from Solomon. So 4 from David, 1 from his son, Solomon. And the other 10, we don't know who wrote them. David might have wrote them. Solomon might have written them. Any number of other people may have written them. It's not important. But for 5 of them, we know who wrote them, and we're explicitly told this is who wrote this psalm. Evidently, it matters to us. We ought to pay attention to that. So, again, the point of these psalms is to get us thinking more about God, to put us in the right frame of reference as we think about God. It's not to tell us anything about David or Solomon. We're not told that Solomon wrote this just so we can say, well, that's interesting. I always wondered if he wrote songs or what other songs he wrote. He wrote the Song of All Songs, right? The superlative song, that book, the Song of Songs. He wrote that book, the greatest song. And he wrote this one, and he wrote another one, I think Psalm 72, I think, was written by Solomon as well. I don't remember that reference is exactly right. But the point of this isn't to tell us that Solomon wrote this song just to satisfy our curiosity. I'll say it another way. Because these songs of ascent, are simply meant to get us thinking in the right frame of reference about God as we prepare our way to travel to Jerusalem, as these original travelers were doing. It's put in this collection for that reason. That this psalm is not going to tell us anything unnecessary about the author. Most of them don't have any information about the author. So I take that to say, evidently, it will do me some good to think about this psalm being written by Solomon. Not just to take these as words, but to say, okay, wait a minute. Solomon wrote these things. What do I know about Solomon? And how does that make this psalm a little more impactful and meaningful and helpful as I sing it? How does it help me get my heart in the right frame of reference? So somehow this psalm is more meaningful if we bear in mind that Solomon is the one who wrote it. So let's just first ask that question. Who was this guy? Who was Solomon? Well, I'd already said, and most of you know, he was King David's son. He wasn't King David's only son, but he was King David's son who would rule in David's place. This was Solomon. After David had died, God visited with Solomon. We don't know quite exactly how that happened, but this is what happened. And God came to Solomon and did what many of us might wish God would do to us and say, ask for anything that you want and I'll give it to you. Just ask me. I'm going to do something for you that I don't do for other people. I'm going to let you ask me one wish and I'll grant you your wish, whatever it may be. Right? Now Solomon asks for one thing. Anybody remember what he asked for? What did Solomon ask for? This is just for the kids. Anybody? For wisdom, right? But a particular kind of wisdom make me wise. He said, give me wisdom to know in and out among your great people, right? They're too great. I'm king. I want them to rule them well, as I ought. And God, this was very pleasing to God. And God says, because you didn't ask for riches or fame or power or anything like that, I'm going to give you the wisdom, but because I'm just so that you've only asked for the best thing, I'm going to give you all these other things too. I'm going to give you the riches and everything else. So this is what God did for King Solomon. He gave him the wisdom, and because he was pleased with what he asked, he gave him riches and might and power as a king. Now Solomon, with all that wisdom and riches and power, was a great builder in Israel. He built and built and built and built. And what's the most famous thing that King Solomon built? Anybody? The thing that King Solomon is most famous for building. The temple. Right. You remember David had in his heart, he wanted to build a house for God. He said, God, you've done so much for me. I want to build a place for you. You're just in that tent, right? When we were in the wilderness, so I erected this tent and you were there, and ever since then, now we've got all these things as a nation. You've been so good and blessed us so much. You're still in that tent. I can't bear to see it. Let me build you a house. Oh, a house. What kind of house I want to build for God? And God said, no, you're not going to build me a house. You're a man of blood, right? You've been shedding blood. You've been a man of war. I'm not going to have a man of war build me a house. That tells us, you may not think of it, but that tells us so much about God, doesn't it? Like, as much as I love David and he's my guy, a man of warfare is not going to build my house. That's just, he won't have it. He won't have his house be built by a man of blood. What a thing. Well, so here, Solomon, but God says, but your son after you, he'll build it. So Solomon builds this temple, and it was the greatest temple that had ever existed and ever will exist in terms of something built by men. So he built this temple for God that his father David had desired to build. What else did he build? He built massive palaces all over the Middle East, not just in Israel. I mean, he built them in other places too, for some of his wives from other countries. He'd build them, a palace kind of halfway between and this kind of thing. It was incredible what he would build. Now, he didn't go build all these things with his own hands, right? He had workers who worked for him and who had skill in these things, and he traded for materials and bartered, and he did all these things as a wise builder, as a wise planner, as a wise king. He built cities. I mean, the list of cities that he built goes on and on and on. That's one thing to say I built a house, but to say I built cities, this city and that city and all these other cities, I built those. That's amazing. Solomon could say that. He also enjoyed a tremendous time of peace under his rule as king, which is why they were able to build so much. Because all these great warriors, the strong men the strong men who grew up in the homes didn't have to keep going off to war and dying in war. That wasn't necessary. They had security. And so they could spend their efforts and their strength building things, and this is what they did. So as in David's time, his father's time, King David's kingship was characterized by warfare and bloodshed. Solomon, rather, enjoyed years and years of peace on all sides. He had rest, and they enjoyed it. Solomon had great armies, but they were hardly tested at all during his reign as king over Israel. When he first became king, there was a few people he had to kind of take care of to make sure things were as they should be, mainly just avenging those people who had been so wicked to his father. But other than that, pretty much all through his reign, there was peace. There was just no one who was willing to fight against the people of Israel. God gave them peace. So that's King Solomon. So we could say a lot more about King Solomon, but I'm going to end with that because I think that's generally what is particularly relevant for this psalm. So verse 1, unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. We see here a remarkable statement from Solomon. Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Here's a guy who built and built and built and built. And he says, unless God's building, those who build it labor in vain. I want to turn, you don't have to turn with me, but I'm going to turn to a few places where we learn some things about Solomon and his building. The first one is in 1 Chronicles 28, verse 20. This is when he's building, or being charged to build the temple. And David, in 1 Chronicles 28:20, David says to Solomon, his son, so David's not dead yet, and he looks to his son Solomon, who's going to rule in his place and going to build the temple, and he says, be strong and courageous, and do it. Do not be afraid, and do not be dismayed, for the Lord God, even my God, is with you. He will not leave you or forsake you until all the work for the service of the house of the Lord is finished. So, in Solomon's experience, he's got a time where he's being entrusted. Think about this. Your father, the great king of Israel, has entrusted to you to build the thing that he most desired to build, that he most desired to do. He says, here, son, take it away. And I don't know anybody who said, yeah, I got this. I mean, you think, really? I need help. I don't want to fail my father. I don't want to fail God. How am I going to ever do this? And David's telling him, be strong and have courage and do it. God's going to be with you all the way through until it's all done. God won't leave you to yourself. He's going to stay with you and keep helping you as you build. And here we read Solomon saying, unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Solomon knew what it was like to have God's special help on a building project. To physically build something and have God with you, assisting you, building the thing. In that sense, everything just went right. We never made a wrong cut. All the supplies arrived in time. It never rained when we needed it to be dry. Everything was perfect. The food supplies were coming. The men were well rested. People weren't getting hurt and injured. Everything just went so smoothly. We had the help of God. And when it came together, it was greater and better than we ever thought it could be. The design was perfect, just as it should have been. He's told to be strong and to have courage. And he's reminded that God would be with him until it's all finished. But Solomon knew the other end of things a little bit too, or at least he was aware of them. In Ecclesiastes chapter 2, I'll read at verse 18. This is from the same man now, Solomon, writing in Ecclesiastes. He says, I hated all my toil, or all my work in which I toil under the sun. I hated it all. Everything I did, I just hated it. What in the world? He says, why? Seeing that I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And who knows whether he'll be wise or a fool. He says, the problem is I'm going to have to leave it to my sons. And I don't know if they're fools or wise. And we find out what happened. They were fools. His sons were fools. What a thing. He says, I hate it. I'm building all this stuff. It's glorious. It's great. But then some fool's going to get it. And what's going to happen to it then? Yet he will be, whether he's wise or fool, yet he'll be master of all for which I toiled and used my wisdom under the sun. I've got all this wisdom and I've used it to build these things and to make these things. And it might all be for nothing. So this also is vanity. It's empty. So I turned about and gave my heart up to despair over all the toil of my labors under the sun, because sometimes a person who has toiled with wisdom and knowledge and skill must leave everything to be enjoyed by someone who did not toil for it. This also is vanity and a great evil. Now this might sound a little bit strange to us, but I mean, any of you who have ever sold a house, you feel the same way, right? You've done some certain work to the house, you've done something, and you've got it a certain way, and you sell it, and when you leave, you think, I hope they take care of it. And I mean, I can remember growing up, we go by a house where we grew up in, and we go by there. it shouldn't matter, but it matters to me what they planted where and what the landscape did and why did they take that sidewalk out and what did they do to the deck. And I like the color. They improved that, but look at, it all matters because you labored for it in some way. You invested in this thing, and it matters to you how it's treated and how it's handled by those who have it after you. Even when you sold it to them, fair and square, right? They paid you for it. It's theirs, but it still matters. And this is what Solomon's saying. He's saying, look, because, this is amazing, because sometimes what you labor for gets given over to somebody who doesn't treat it well, he says, I'm just totally despairing. I gave my heart up to despair, because sometimes this happens. This also is vanity, and he says, a great evil. A great evil. What has a man from all the toil and striving of heart with which he toils beneath the sun? For all his days are full of sorrow, and his work is a vexation. Even in the night his heart does not rest. This also is vanity. Now hear that. So here's a guy, he's working and he's laboring. He's constantly thinking about how he can build great things, what he can accomplish, what he can create in his own name, and apply his wisdom to make. And all his days are full of sorrow. It's hard, right? Every day it's hard. He's constantly we have that phrase, keep your nose to the grindstone. He's constantly there working and laboring, trying to improve. And all day long, his work is just difficult for him. It's hard. It's frustration. There's not a lot of joy in it, even though that's what he's chosen to do. Even in the night, when he takes his rest, his heart, down in his heart, he does not rest. He's constantly worried about this. He says, this also is vanity, emptiness, useless. What Solomon says in Psalm 127 is, unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Now, we know this to be true, right? Without God watching over us, without God's blessing, without God's favor, nothing succeeds. There's nothing for us. And he also says, unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. We were just in Ecclesiastes. Let's stay there and go to Ecclesiastes chapter 9. Right? It is in vain that unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. Look at Ecclesiastes 9, verse 11. Again I saw that under the sun the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to the intelligent, nor favor to those with knowledge, but time and chance happen to them all. Now, Solomon writes that he's not thinking about having the favor of God with you at that moment. He's just saying, look, I look out in the world and here's what I see. Under the sun, the race is not always to the swift. It's not always the fastest guy that wins the race, right? I know that. I can remember growing up watching the Olympics, the U.S. sprint team, 4x100. At that time, if you added up all the sprint times from these guys that were getting a race for us, nobody should even be close. We were just going to it wasn't even going to be a close race. Nowadays, like Jamaica's really good, but back then it was just the U.S. We dominated. We lost. You know why we lost? Because we had to pass these batons. And no matter how much our team had practiced passing the batons, we got to the race and we dropped the baton. And we lost the race. The race doesn't always go to the swift, right? Time and chance happen to them all. I mean, those guys could do that another 100 times and never drop that baton, but they dropped it that day. They lost. The race is not always to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise. Sometimes there are wise people who are without things, in poverty maybe, and it wasn't because they were fools. Nor riches always to the intelligent, nor favor to those with knowledge, but time and chance happen to them all. What a thing. Time and chance happen to them all. So you might say, well, we've got a city, we're going to fortify it, we're going to put all these watchmen out on the towers, and we're going to make it so that nobody can overrun our cities. Well, unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchmen stay the watchman stays awake in vain. Remember Adam a couple weeks ago did this illustration for you kids about what a watchman was, a night watchman. You remember that? And he had his, I don't know what all you, his shuka on. I didn't ask him to bring it because I wasn't going to wear it, but though it looked pretty cool. Right? And he's got this little club, right? And all this stuff he's got with him to protect, to defend against maybe an animal coming in at night to get at their animals that they have, maybe the chickens or things like that. You want to protect your livestock, and you want to protect your city. If they were thinking another village was going to come attack them, they probably would have just more than just a watch nightman or two. They'd probably have lots of the men armed and ready, prepared. Well, unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. Time and chance happen to us all. You can build, you can erect, you can protect, you can do everything you can do. You can have all the insurance plans you want to. Time and chance happen to us all. It doesn't matter. There's no security apart from God unless the Lord watches over the city. Three other texts on this, as I just kind of try to bring this out more. In Proverbs chapter 21, verses 30 and 31 says, "No wisdom, no understanding, no counsel can avail against the Lord. The horse is made ready for the day of battle, but the victory belongs to the Lord." Right? You say, well, you've got all this wisdom and understanding and counsel, and you've prepared, and you've got your horse ready for warfare. Well, it's not going to prevail. The day of battle belongs to the Lord. He's the one who decides who wins. The victory belongs to the Lord. Make all the preparations you will. God's going to decide the outcome. Doesn't mean we shouldn't make preparations, but none of our preparations are effective apart from God's blessing. Psalm 33, verses 16 through 18 says it this way: "The king is not saved by his great army. A warrior is not delivered by his great strength. The war horse is a false hope for salvation, and by its great might it cannot rescue. Behold, the eye of the Lord is on those who fear him, on those who hope in his steadfast love, that he may deliver their soul from death and keep them alive in famine." What a thing. So here comes death. Death comes upon someone who's looking to God, and in this instance, God delivers them. Or a famine comes. God keeps them alive. Here's the other guy not trusting in God. It's a king. He's got a great army with his great strength. A war horse. He's riding a war horse. I mean, if you're in a war without guns and you've got a war horse, you've got a tremendous advantage. And here they come. This great, strong horse. Well, sorry, that's a false hope. You think you're going to win the war now. That's a false hope. Men might tell you, they might counsel together and say, well, look, you've got all these horses, you're going to win. They can't stand up against you. That's a false hope. That's a false hope. But God can deliver. So again, unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. Another one of these, Song of Ascents, Psalm 121, verses 3 through 5 says this, speaking of God, "He will not let your foot be moved. He who keeps you will not slumber. Behold, he who keeps Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord is your keeper, shade on your right hand." And that's what it means to have God as your helper. He will not let your foot be moved. He who keeps you will not slumber. And that's a good thing to know that, here the watchmen staying awake, and we hope, what happens when the watchmen are there at night? We hope they're staying awake. But we're told here, God, He who keeps Israel, right? He keeps us who trust in Him. He will not slumber. He'll watch over us. He won't let us be moved. He'll protect us. What a thing. Solomon knew what this was like, to have God's help. His whole reign, almost the entirety of his reign, was one of God watching over Israel so that nothing happened. It was amazing. He didn't have to worry about all this stuff. But there came a time when he turned away from God, and God changed things on him. Let's look at 1 Kings chapter 11. 1 Kings 11. Remember that At the end of Solomon's life, he turned away from God. Some of you kids, we've gone over this. We'll just pick up in verse 9. And the Lord, 1 Kings 11, verse 9. And the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice and had commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not go after other gods. But he did not keep what the Lord commanded. Therefore the Lord said to Solomon, so now that you've turned away from God, here's what God says. Since this has been your practice, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes, that is the rules that I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and will give it to your servant. Yet for the sake of David your father, I will not do it in your days, but I will tear it out of the hand of your son. However, I will not tear away all the kingdom, but I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of David my servant and for the sake of Jerusalem that I've chosen. Verse 14, and the Lord raised up an adversary against Solomon, Hadad the Edomite. He was of the royal house in Edom. And it gives this story a little bit about this guy named Hadad and talks about him. We'll look at verse 23. God also raised up as an adversary to him Rezon, the son of Eliada, who had fled from his master Hadadezer, king of Zobah. And he gathered men about him, listen to this, and became leader of a marauding band after the killing by David. And they went to Damascus and lived there and made him king in Damascus. And he was an adversary to Solomon, doing harm as Hadad did. And he loathed Israel and reigned over Syria. And you have another, verse 26. Boam, the son of his name was Zeruiah, a widow, also lifted up his hand against the king. So here you got God is raising up all these different men. And one of them that was specifically mentioned as a marauding band. So here's a group of men, soldiers, who get together, and they just go from town to town and steal and kill and pillage and destroy as they want. They just go from place to place, and they're just a terror. This is what's happening in Solomon. I mean, what happened to God keeping watch over the city? You see? It's an amazing thing. Now, this had happened when Solomon had grown old, when he'd been rich and wealthy and had kind of stopped seeking God. Then what happened? Well, then God raised these people up against him. And God warned him this was going to happen. So again, these are things we know to be true about working and about our efforts in the world. There's no guarantee of success without God's blessing. If we turn our back on God, or if we're not doing what God would have us to do, we have no guarantee, right? It's not that it's guaranteed to fail, but you have no guarantee. You have no guarantee. Time and chance happen to us all. Now, this is what Solomon's been telling us so far. There's no certainty of safety unless God is the one who guards us. There's no certainty of success unless God is the one who builds with us. That's pretty basic. Helpful to know some of these things about Solomon's life, but it's a pretty basic statement. Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. We get that. All of our efforts to build and to produce, to protect and defend, every sort of thing we set out to accomplish, none of it has any firm foundation whatsoever. Time and chance happen to us all. At the bottom level of all that we do, it is only the Lord that provides any real success, any real safety for us. Our most basic need is the help of God. Now then, verse 2. It is vain, then, that you rise up early and go late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil. He says that is vain. For he gives to his beloved sleep. Now, the assumption of this psalm is that you are someone who God is for. God is for you. Right? Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. And you say, okay, well, I just need to find out, I guess, what God's building and what God's watching over and get there. Well, what he's saying is, Solomon's saying, you, that's who. He's blessed. And it is in vain then that you are rising up early and going late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil, for he gives to his beloved sleep, or to his beloved rest. Listen, the idea that you would spend your days, if this is true, that you can build all you want to, but if God's not in it, it's going to be vain. And you can protect yourselves and do all the different things you want to. Try to situate yourself against risk all you want to, but it doesn't matter unless God's in it. That ought to calm you down. That's amazing. Like most people, if they would hear, look, you can do all you want to, and if God's not in it, it's not going to succeed. They think, well, I better try everything that I possibly can then, right? I want to be as diversified as possible in all of my efforts to insulate myself from risk and harm. Why? So that if this thing fails, this other thing succeeds, and so that whatever happens, my house still stands. And you miss the point if that's the way you're approaching it. You miss the point entirely. It's the opposite. It is in vain. If the attitude is you hear this and you think, well, I've got to rise up early and get up and work, and I got to be late to rest, I got to work, I got to plan, I got to scheme, I got to think, I got to figure this thing out, I've got to succeed. And you're worried all day long, eating the bread of anxious toil, you've missed it because God gives His beloved rest. That's what God does. He gives rest to His beloved. What a thing. This is the verse that so changed my thinking on so many things in my own life. I was the guy rising up early and late to rest. And we're still that way a little bit. I mean, everybody's relative, right, to each other, right? Some people need more sleep than others, okay? I don't have myself in a position where I feel that I'm rising up early and going late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil. But I was for a while. This is a real reality in my experience. But you read this, I remember reading this, it's vain that you rise up early and go late to rest. And I thought, well, why is that? I mean, I'm trying to apply myself and do all that I can. Eating the bread of anxious toil, for he gives to his beloved sleep. And that hit me like a sledgehammer. He gives to his beloved sleep. In other words, it's not of God's mind that you would be working yourself to this extent that there's no rest, there's no joy, there's just sickness, right? Because you've worked yourself like that, and there's nothing left. That's not God's intention. He gives to his beloved rest. He gives it. I mean, you can say, well, I'm going to get rest for myself. I'm going to secure this from it. It's not going to be there. There's no guarantee of that. But God does give it. Yes, we should be diligent. Yes, we should work hard. Yes, we should obey God and all these other things. We ought to apply ourselves to wisdom. We ought to build. We ought to protect. We ought to have watchmen. We ought to do those things. But our trust isn't there. And we don't engage in those activities in such a way that we think we're the ones who have to make it happen. God gives us these things. If these things are constantly eluding us, it's because we're not seeking God the way we ought to. He gives to his beloved sleep. Now, I don't mean that everything's easy, but you saw this earlier. I read from Ecclesiastes in chapter 2. You see the same kind of thing. Let me just read it again. I hated here's somebody getting up early, going to sleep late, and eating the bread of anxious toil, and not having rest. Here's Solomon. I hated all my toil in which I toil under the sun. Hang on, I want to make sure that's the one, because it might be the other one that we read from Ecclesiastes. So this is it, Ecclesiastes 2. I hated all my toil in which I toil under the sun, seeing that I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And who knows whether he will be wise or a fool? Yet he will be master of all. I toiled and used my wisdom under the sun. This also is vanity. So I turned about and gave my heart up to despair over all the toil of my labors under the sun, because sometimes a person who has toiled with wisdom and knowledge and skill must leave everything to be enjoyed by someone who did not toil for it. This also is vanity and a great evil. What has a man from all the toil and striving of heart with which he toils beneath the sun? For all his days are full of sorrow. We're reading about eating the bread of anxious toil or sorrowful bread. It's the same idea. And his work is a vexation. Even in the night, his heart does not rest. This also is vanity. Solomon knows this from experience. This is what it's like. You can't even sleep at night. This thing gnaws at you. You're trying to work and to build something and to have something for yourself and to pass on to others perhaps. And that's no way to be thinking about it. Instead, you ought to just be coming here and just say, look, all that is vain. If you're in that rat race, that's vanity. You need to be thinking about just seeking God. For he gives to his beloved sleep. He gives to his beloved sleep. Isaiah 26:3 says this, you keep him in perfect peace whose mind is stayed on you because he trusts in you. Because he trusts in you. Now, think of that. I don't know how many times I've told our kids, just trust me. Trust me. Now, when you say to someone, just trust me, you kind of invite on yourself all the responsibilities of their well-being. Because you're saying, if you venture out on me, I'll hold you up. You're safe with me. You trust me. And God says, invites us again and again, doesn't he, to trust me. Or you might think of somebody maybe who owns a business, and they start this business, and people begin to come to them for work, and they say, look, you come work for me, and things are going to go well, I'm going to pay you this much, and we're going to expand, and we're going to grow. If you're the business owner, you've taken on a lot of responsibility. There's a lot of families and a lot of people looking to you to make sure this thing stays afloat and doesn't fail, right? People moving in from other states maybe to come and build their lives as a family. Here, you've got a lot of responsibility to make sure this thing works. Well, here's God kind of in the same sense. He's saying, look, trust me, trust me, trust me, come to me. You don't have to work so hard for those things. It's my desire to provide you with rest. You may not have all the things that you envision about, you'd hoped you'd have one day, but I will give you rest if you'll just trust me. And here it says, God keeps him in perfect peace whose mind is fixed or stayed on God because he trusts in him. So it's just God saying, if you'll look to me, I will undertake for you. I'll guarantee I'll keep you in perfect peace. I'll make sure that you're able, if you'll trust me now, with what's going on, I promise you what's going to happen is I will keep you in a condition where you're able to continually be at peace in your mind, trusting me with what I'm doing. But you've got to trust me now. Trust me now, and trusting me later is going to be easy. It'll just happen. I'm going to keep providing for you and keep you in a condition where I'm protecting you and you can be at peace. No longer eating the bread of anxious toil, rising up early and going late to rest, because God will give to his beloved sleep. He simply gives us sleep. One other text in Isaiah on that, chapter 30 and verse 15, says, for thus said the Lord God, the Holy One of Israel, in returning and rest you shall be saved, in quietness and in trust shall be your strength. So God says to the people of Israel, coming back to me and just resting, just take a break from these efforts and these schemes you're making to stay alive as a country, and look to me and see what I have to say about the matter. And you'll find strength. What a thing. Now, in what seems like the ultimate disjointed psalm, Solomon is speaking here about God giving us rest, and he turns right into the next verse talking about having lots of kids. And it sounds like it's impossible, right? I mean, I thought Solomon was wise. There's no way, but they're right there, right? I mean, for he gives to his beloved sleep. Look, he says, look, I mean, it's amazing. It's like I'm reasoning with you. Like, listen, God will give you rest. What do you mean? Well, look, let me tell you. I mean, children are a heritage from God. The fruit of the womb, a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the children of one's youth. Blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them. God gives you rest. And you're thinking, what are you talking about? Well, we need to think about, I think we need to not be so prone to think of our children the way our culture teaches us to, as a burden and a drain and an unwelcome responsibility, and more like they did then. right? Where children were seen, everyone from birth on through, as a tremendous blessing. Who's going to take care of you in your old age? Who's going to, when you're a grandparent, who is going to be your delight? Is it your children's children? That's what you hope for. Grandchildren are the crown of the aged. And that's right. What a thing. When you see your children as a blessing. And here it is, behold, children are a heritage from the Lord. So here's a guy, he's working, he's trying to build this house, watching over a city. God says, no, I'll provide you the things you need. Listen, look elsewhere. Look elsewhere. With all your energy and all your effort, look elsewhere. Children are a heritage from the Lord. It's those kids you've got. The fruit of the womb is a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the children of one's youth. Arrows in the hand of a warrior. Now what's an arrow, right? You shoot out of a bow, right? So you've got an arrow in this man's hand. Now you don't walk around normally with arrows in your hand, right? Even if you're going out hunting, you don't walk around with the arrow in your hand. You have it in the quiver, maybe back here, maybe down here, maybe over here, wherever it is, you've got the arrows in the quiver. And when you get ready to draw, when you get ready to attack, then you grab this thing in your hand, and now you're ready, and you take aim, and you fire. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are children of one's youth. Now there is a video, I know Adam has seen, because we've watched it, where there's this guy, he's an archer, he's someone who works with bows and arrows, and his attempt is to kind of bring back what he considers from old writings to be how they maybe used to do it. Because now we just kind of grab this, we're just looking and it's one shot and then 10 minutes later you make another shot, whatever. And he's like, look, these guys, they had to fire like, I don't know what it says on that one writing. It was like, in so many seconds they had to be able to fire off and hit their target so quickly. So he's got like 3 or 4 arrows in one hand. And he goes and he just shoots these things like crazy. It's amazing. Jump up in the air and shoot like 3 shots. It's like, what? Hitting his targets every time. It seems ridiculous. Now, I'm not advocating that. I don't know anything about it. But I'm just telling you, arrows in the guy's hand, right? Not just one arrow even, but he's got multiple. He's ready. He means to do some harm. He means to do some serious damage. This guy's an expert. Arrows in the hand of a warrior are the children of one's youth. If you see a warrior and he's got all these arrows, it's kind of intimidating. There's some strength there. There's some might there. There's some ability there to do some harm. He's a warrior. He can accomplish what he sets out to do. Blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them, who's got lots of these. He shall not be put to shame when he speaks with his enemies in the gate. Now, the way I understand this, maybe it's not so intuitive, and maybe you disagree, and that's okay. I just can give you my own interpretation. Is that here's a man, he's reached old age, or older, middle age maybe beyond that, and he comes to the gate of the city, and he's got an enemy, some men who oppose him. But they're careful to what they say, and they're careful what they do, because this guy has got a quiver full of sons. Half pounds related, and they're all his children, and their kids. And it's like he's the patriarch of the town, in a sense. You just don't mess with this guy, right? You understand. So here's this man comes. Children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the children of one's youth. Blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them. He shall not be put to shame when he speaks with his enemies at the gate. It's combative. The whole tone changes from God providing for you and giving you rest. Now it's a sense of, there's a combative sense. Yes, children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb a reward. That's great. They're like arrows in the hand of a warrior. Fill your quiver, right? You're blessed if you have a full quiver. And when you meet your enemy at the gate, they won't put you to shame. It's very combative all of a sudden. And I think this is what we're meant to see. It's that the guy who's thinking to, or the parents perhaps, but the man particularly here I think is in view, who's thinking to establish something for himself. And he seeks to, I'm going to build what I've got. I'm going to set watchmen out. We're going to build some great edifice or accomplish something wonderful. Whatever it may be, however you want to define it, he's not it's all vain. God is the one who provides those things. God will provide him rest. If that man wants to engage and invest himself somewhere, look to the home, look to your children, invest in them as a father. This man, when he has the particular blessing of God, he's got a full quiver. This man, even when he speaks to his enemies at the gate, he's not put to shame. Now, that's the way I think Solomon meant it, but we're told this is a song of ascents. And it's a little bit odd to think about traveling up to Jerusalem for the feasts of God, and I've got all my kids in tow, and I can't wait. Man, when next town up, he and I have never gotten along, and my kids are grown and big now, and I can't wait. That doesn't fit with we're getting our hearts right before God. We're thinking about what it means to have God as our provider. We're going to celebrate the feasts of God. It takes on a little bit different meaning when we're talking about this song as a psalm of ascents. Singing this on the way. And the difference, I think, that a slightly different spin it puts on it is this. What may be here in terms of something about, looks like it's kind of almost a combative psalm at the end, I think is meant rather just to speak about strength and integrity, dignity. And all those things are there in the psalm on the surface, but I think those are meant to be highlighted, particularly as we think about a psalm of ascents. And I think the idea is this: as you're traveling up there to Jerusalem with your children, singing the songs of God, preparing to take this feast, you're thinking about those kids and the strength they provide and the blessing that they are, not as they've got my back, or somehow we've become something as a family. But rather, as we relate to God, and we're saying, I'm engaged in these kids, we're raising them up as a heritage for God. God's given them to us. They're a reward from God, and we're raising them up for Him. To be strong, to be brave, to be warriors in this land for God, to stand for justice, to protect those who are taken advantage of. This is the idea. And so I want to just turn to a couple texts as we think about that idea as we close. What's likely on their minds? I don't see how it could not be. The first maybe obvious one, Deuteronomy 6:7, of course. I'll start in verse 4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. Verse 7, you shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. As you walk on the way, here you are singing the songs of God. Your children are such a blessing to you as you come. They're not just the kids you had to pack extra change of clothes for, and why we had to bring the extra mule this time was because the kids, we're bringing all the kids with us this time, and we've got to pack more. It's not just that. They are a tremendous blessing from God. And to be raised in this way, to be taught in this way. Or Paul could tell Timothy, right? We all remember 2 Timothy 3:14 and 15. But as for you, right, Timothy, continue in what you have learned and have firmly believed, knowing from whom you learned it, and how from childhood you have been acquainted with the sacred writings, which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith in Christ Jesus. So here's Timothy, from his childhood, had known the sacred writings, had been taught and instructed in the things of God. Proverbs, last two texts. Proverbs chapter 10 and verse 1. A wise son makes a glad father, but a foolish son is a sorrow to his mother. So if you want to be the kind of parents, right, who are mentioned in Psalm 127, where you receive these children as a heritage from God, as a reward, where your children are for you like arrows in the hand, well, we've got to have wise children. We've got to raise them in a certain way. We've got to think of them as arrows. We've got to think of them as weapons, as things that are useful in the world, as things that God has a purpose and a plan for, a point. This thing can do something. Or Proverbs chapter 17 and verse 25. A foolish son is a grief to his father, and bitterness to her who bore him. A foolish son is a grief to his father, and bitterness to her who bore him. Now, why would I end with a verse like that? Well, I don't exactly mean to end completely with that verse, but here's what I mean. I mean, we're in a culture, it's not just art, it's not just things are just so bad today, they've gotten so bad today. They've always been this way among people. But most people, see their children as an inconvenience, as a burden, as a distraction from the real things they want to be about. I hear all the time, man, kids are expensive. They just cost so much. Well, of course they do. And they're worth every bit of it. But you can have a son be a grief to his father and bitterness to her who bore him if you don't invest in them in this way. If you don't think of our kids as a blessing and as arrows to be in the hand, shot out. We want a quiver full, right? If we don't see them in that way, if we don't take our parenting in a sense and aim our children in a direction and send them off, we're liable to have fools. We're liable to be grieved later. You don't check out of the parenting endeavor to build yourself a city, to build yourself a house, to build yourself these other things. You can't be too busy for the kids. You can't be. You can't be. I'm going to just read that Psalm again, 127. Again, unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. It is in vain that you rise up early and go late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil, for he gives to his beloved sleep. And God provides you these things. You need not worry about them. Yes, there are things you have to do. You've got to, he who doesn't work doesn't eat, right? So you've got to work, you've got to watch, you've got to protect, you've got to be wise, you've got to do, we're told elsewhere in Proverbs, right? You do this thing and that thing, you don't know which one's going to succeed. You don't just throw all that wisdom out, but having that wisdom, you don't act in such a way in your life as though you don't believe that God's helping you, that God means to give you rest. You don't spend your days anxiously worrying about this and that and always fretful about things. You're not constantly concerned about what's going to happen if this fails, what if that fails, what if that fails. You have some trust in God. You've done what you can do. God's for you. Leave it to Him. Where would God have us spend our energies instead? Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the children of one's youth. Blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them. He shall not be put to shame when he speaks with his enemies in the gate. Well, that is at least the emphasis I wanted to set forward today. Are there questions, comments, disagreements, other texts maybe you want to bring up, quotations, whatever, from this psalm?